1 year ago, we saw an NHL blockbuster trade between the Arizona Coyotes and the Vancouver Canucks. Today, we're going to take a look at this trade, see how things have played out, and decide who, a year later, do we think won this deal. It was kind of complicated, but it looks like things might be of a different opinion now than at the time. We'll discuss this coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, today we're going back into the future. We're looking at a blockbuster trade from 1 year ago and to analyze it a little bit further as to who we think won this deal. Obviously, right now, the Vancouver Canucks and the Arizona Coyotes are in very different situations. The Canucks obviously still have their two players they acquired in this deal, whereas a lot has changed in Arizona as most of the players acquired on the other side had 1 year remaining under contracts and have since departed. But let's take a look here at the full details of this trade and talk through it to see really who got the better side of this deal. Now, going to the Vancouver Canucks was Oliver Ekman-Larsson, of course, the top Arizona Coyotes defenseman, team captain. Arizona retained 12% of his salary, dropping his cap hit for the Canucks to $7.26 million. Of course, at that point in time, he had 6 more years remaining on his deal and had a no-move clause that he had to waive to go to Vancouver as well. Of course, a year later, he now has 5 years remaining on that contract. Of course, they also received forward Conor Garland, who was a restricted free agent at the time, so he received him and his signing rights. A matter of a few days later, they came to terms with Garland on a 5-year contract valued at $4.95 million per season. So all in all, they got basically just a little smidge over $12 million in salary that they were able to take on with these two players coming to Vancouver, and of course both come with a fair bit of term. Now, going to the Arizona Coyotes was 3 roster players and a couple of draft picks. The roster players included Antoine Roussel, who was making $3 million and had 1 year remaining. Also included Jay Beagle, who was making $3 million and had 1 year remaining. And of course, Louis Eriksson, the longtime disgruntled Canuck, who had basically wanted out, but really couldn't. The Canucks couldn't find a trade for him any sooner than this. He also had to waive, I believe, a no-move clause. Of course, Louis Eriksson had been long rumored to be on his way out of Vancouver, but it was tough finding a trade for him, given his performance and his contract. But Louis Eriksson had $6 million on his deal, and it was also the final year of his contract. So that's $12 million going out the door. So from a money perspective, obviously in the beginning, it looked like the Canucks obviously took on less money because Garland wasn't signed. Once he became signed and the deal was agreed upon, essentially their cap situation went up slightly by a couple $100,000, given the fact that OEL, with his retained amount and Garland's new contract, totaled slightly more than what these three players were earning. The main difference here, though, is that the Coyotes were getting 3 players with 1 year left on it, and now the Canucks are tied to these other 2 players for a long, long time. Now, of course, there was more to this trade. The Arizona Coyotes also received the Vancouver Canucks 2021 first-round selection, which ended up being the 9th overall pick, which the Coyotes then used to select Dylan Gunter, one of the top prospects from the Western Hockey League's Edmonton Oil Kings. Gunter is projected to be a top-scoring winger, kind of a real potential sniper, in my opinion. Had a real solid year this past year. Looks like a really, really nice looking prospect there for the Coyotes. They also received a 2022 second round pick, which was the 47th overall selection in the 2022 NHL draft. They did end up trading that pick. The pick ended up being selected by the Minnesota Wild, where they selected Hunter Height at that number 47 pick. But they used that pick to get Jack McBain from Minnesota, of course, who was one of the top college prospects who was not going to sign with Minnesota. It was well known he wanted to sign elsewhere, so they traded his signing rights over to the Arizona Coyotes for this second round selection. So all in all, basically the Coyotes get 3 players that are all 4th liners, making $12 million total for 1 year, and they get 2 really good prospects in Dylan Gunter and Jack McBain. So ultimately here, the Coyotes are already done now with those 3 roster players now that we're a year later. None of those 3 players have NHL contracts deep into free agency. It was recently reported that Louis Eriksson was very likely going to go play in Europe. Not a huge shocker. I did not expect NHL opportunities for him at this point in his career. And Antoine Roussel and Jay Beagle right now do not have new contracts either. Whether or not they get signed as a 1-year cheap deal or something like that, I'm not sure. It may or may not happen. I'm not sure if they're looking to continue playing or what the status is. The fact of the matter is, though, is that the Coyotes are no longer committed or obligated to those players or those contracts, but they have these really nice prospects to help build with their future. Now, on the Vancouver side of things, they've had 1 season of Oliver Ekman-Larsson. They've had 1 season of Connor Garland. Of course, now keep in mind, Vancouver has since had a regime change during this process here. Of course, they, Jim Benning would have been responsible for facilitating that trade and signing the Garland contract, and he's out now. Of course, they now have Jim Rutherford as president of hockey ops and Patrick Alvin as the general manager. It's been mentioned numerous times by the new regime here that they really want to try to find some salary cap flexibility and felt there was no way that this Canuck team, who was really nowhere near being a cup contender, should have been capped out that badly the way that they were. But a lot of that was due to misspending here by Jim Benning on, bottom 6 players making way too much money. And really, this trade, to me, it's only a year later, but even from the beginning, it has not aged well. A lot of people were confused over Oliver Ekman-Larsson and the Canucks, why they were so eager to get him. There was a lot of rumors and talk the year before that Oliver Ekman-Larsson might end up in Vancouver. It was down to the Canucks or the Boston Bruins were the teams that he had believed to be only okayed the Arizona Coyotes to consider a trade to. And nothing really came to be. It was believed that the Canucks were way more interested in trying to get a deal done more so than the Bruins. At least that was in the rumor mill. And it never happened, but then eventually it did. Now, like I said, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, unfortunately, was painted in a situation where I think he's been overrated for a really long time. I mean, some thought maybe going to Vancouver where he didn't have to be the captain, he didn't have to be the guy, so to speak, that it might take some of the pressure off and he could play better. And I don't think he had an absolutely atrocious season. I don't think that would be fair for me to say, but I still don't think that it's fair to say that Oliver Ekman-Larsson is anywhere near a $7 million defenseman. And I think that this trade ultimately has kind of really had a major negative impact on the Vancouver Canucks salary cap situation to the point that it could slow down this team moving forward. Now, at the end of the day, if you think about it, the Coyotes were not happy with this contract. I mean, they could see the decline in his game, and they could see how it was not working out. They seen that their team obviously was struggling financially. Their team was struggling on the ice and felt a couple of things. One, it didn't make sense for them to have a long-term deal like this with all that money tied to it based on where the team was heading. Secondly, I think because of their financial woes and considerations, they really wanted to move that money off the books, which totally makes sense. I completely understand why it made sense for them to move him. I just don't know that really it made sense for any NHL team to acquire him for this type of trade. I mean, ultimately, the Vancouver Canucks, yes, they shed at $12 million worth of bad money, but it was only a year. Can you imagine? For example, the Coyotes in most situations, when you're trading a contract that's considered bad, unfavorable, whatever, you quite often have to add a sweetener to that deal to get another team to take a look. Look, some of the teams we've seen this offseason in 2022 struggle to offload money, like James Van Riemsdyk in Philadelphia. We know the Islanders have been working at moving a contract or two, and it's last year and the year before it seemed to be a lot easier than it is now. The prices just kind of went up. Cap space is becoming that much more of a valuable commodity given how little there is of it around the league, and it's coming really, really challenging, right? So at the end of the day here, this contract would have been, the Coyotes would have had to pay somebody to take it, in a sense. Like we've seen Max Pacioretty be traded for nothing to Carolina. They knew that they had the leverage. Vegas was over a barrel with their cap situation, and they basically said, we'll take them. We'll take them at full cap hit, but we're not giving you anything. We'll give you future considerations, and that's it. And that's how it went down. And the Coyotes could have pulled off a similar deal, really, in my opinion. So if you think about it, Vancouver giving the 3 players that are under contract, Roussel, Beagle, Eriksson, for Oliver Ekman-Larsson, maybe the trade's not exactly like that, like 1 for 3, for example, but it's a situation where Arizona could say, okay, we move this contract out and we get some bad money back, but the term is way cheaper, way less, so we're going to be off the hook of this way sooner. That, to me, almost could have been a deal on itself. And then on top of that, you got Connor Garland, and you got these 2 draft picks. You wouldn't have given up a first and second for Connor Garland. I don't think that's the case. So now the Arizona Coyotes move on from Garland, who was a good, productive player, but I guess, they felt they could afford to move on from based on the direction the team was heading. And now they get Gunter and McBain. Now the Canucks never would have got McBain because he wasn't a drafted player, but still, I bet you Vancouver right now, Jim Rutherford's probably sitting back saying, man, instead of having OEL, I'd really rather have Dylan Gunter. Obviously they like Connor Garland to some degree. His name has been mentioned already in trade rumor speculation, as well as they look for cap flexibility. Garland would have some value. He's still in his mid-20s. The salary's not outrageous. He's, reasonably productive. I think he could give a little bit more, and I think he could be a little bit better than what he was last year, but it wasn't terrible. He had a good year, I think, overall for his first season in Vancouver, and given a full year now under Bruce Boudreau, I would suspect maybe he could do even better this year. I have no problem with the Connor Garland acquisition at all. I just don't know that you would have given up a first and a second to get him if you think of the other pieces of the trade kind of being a little bit more even, like bad money for bad money. I think Vancouver would have had to probably give up something else more than just those contracts to get OEL. Much as OEL was a bad contract, it's the term is the problem here, right? It's because it had 6 years left on it. 6 years for 3 contracts for only had 1 year. Like, this is really a problem that I think why Jim Benning has ended up out of a job. Like, he really set this team back, in my opinion. I do not like this trade one little bit for Vancouver. At the time, it seemed like, okay, maybe this is decent. The Canucks unloaded a really ton of bad money. And if OEL can improve his play and show that he can be that defenseman that a lot of people thought he could be, maybe, and I stress just maybe, it'll be okay. And it's not. It's not. That blue line is a problem for Vancouver, in my opinion, a big problem. And he's a big part of that. And a lot of it is not so much because of who he is and how he plays. It's the money that's attached to him that goes with it. It's just that simple. So all in all, given the interesting prospects here that the Coyotes got, and they get out of all these bad money off the books in 1 year, right now I'm going to go ahead and say I think Arizona wins this deal. Honestly, I think that to give up Connor Garland, which is a good player, but they got all this, these 2 really good prospects in return, and they get out of the OEL contract. I can live with that if I'm Arizona. So for right now, that's what I think. I think Arizona wins this deal. I think this is a terrible trade for Vancouver. As much as I like Garland, I don't want to have to be tied to OEL for 5 or 6 years to get him. If they wouldn't have done this trade, they would have had $12 million come off the cap. Yes, they'd be more flexible in free agency for the work on the blue line. They wouldn't have Garland, but that's not the end of the world. They could have probably figured out a way to get a similar player for a different price, either through free agency or a different trade or something of that nature. And they would have had their first round pick. They could have Dylan Gunter coming up as well, who could easily be Connor Garland or better in a not too distant future. So to me, the Canucks really messed up on this trade. I think the Coyotes win, but I want to know what you think. Down in the comments, so let me know your thoughts a year later on the blockbuster deal between the Coyotes and the Canucks, and we'll discuss further in the comments. If you're new to the channel, of course, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.